Mark, our last set of questions were very specific ones around resilience. So we're quite interested in what the community saw as shocks like bushfires, floods, for example, those sorts of events, and also some of those longer term stresses like housing affordability and climate change.
I think these are really important factors for a council to take on. You know, a lot of what we've been talking about this evening has been individual services and facilities, and council has to get that right. But that's not operating in a vacuum. You need to understand that your community has got shocks and stresses, has got wellbeing issues at times, and it's council's role in part to help them through those issues.
And it's also important for us to understand not just what's important to the community, but how well they feel that they can cope, or how resilient they are themselves, and what assistance we can provide.
And to that end, what we've done is put a question in which is almost like a proxy for resilience, and then looked at the differences between those that feel as if they're resilient versus those that may be struggling, to see what are their pain points. So we go into some detail in this last section.
And it's also important too, because every second year we do the community wellbeing survey, and this information also helps us, and we've got at least one marker question that's common. Absolutely.
By keeping questions similar across the waves, you are just every year keeping a tab on your community. Very important.
Fantastic. Looking forward to hearing, Mark.
Great, thank you. So the last section is a series of questions that were added in 2020 to deal with resilience within the Willoughby LGA. And in essence, you know, I don't have benchmarks for these questions. This is us setting a benchmark for Willoughby LGA. Now, we had 15 different shocks and stresses. Shocks are basically things like short-term bushfires, storms and so on. So short-term events that happen and pass on, as opposed to stresses, which are longer-term things, which might be climate change or the economy and so on. And what we asked people to do was go through a list of 15 shocks and stresses and tell us how concerned they are about each one, using a scale not at all concerned, code 1, up to very concerned, code 5. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, other than to say that I guess the interesting thing for me was that there are a mix of shocks and stresses. So for instance, last summer bushfire is the highest level of concern. So that's a shock. COVID, probably more of a stress, I would say, because it's going to last a while, is second. Climate change is third. Economy is fourth. And then last summer storms and floods is fifth. The reason I'm making such a point about this is because I asked a similar question for another council last year, and their scores, and I'm just trying to, because I've scrolled them down here. Last summer's bushfire was 4.07, a mean score of 4.07. Last summer's storms was 3.87. So I think the first one, 4.07, was just under your score, but the storms, 3.87, was well above your score. But the climate change was 3.27. And my point here is that the residents in that particular LGA were concerned about the shocks. That didn't translate into an understanding or a concern about the stresses, seemingly. Whereas in this LGA, the fact that climate change is there as the third one suggests that the community understands we've got shocks and we've got to be concerned about them, but we've also got to be concerned about the bigger picture, the stresses that are underlying potentially some of those shocks. So in that sense, I thought it was a good mix of shocks and stresses that were coming out. Now, this is only part of it because there were 15 and I think there's 7 or so shown here. The next 7 or 8 are on the second page. And again, I'm not going through these in detail because I really want to get to the bottom one. And that is your ability to cope with and adapt to change. We've treated that attribute almost as a proxy for resilience. If you think about it, your ability to cope with and adapt to change is a way of saying how resilient are you. So we have taken that one attribute and used it to analyse the other 14. which is this table here, and it's appalling, but please bear with me. The point of this was we wanted to compare the green column. Those are people who are not very or not at all concerned about their own ability to cope and adapt to change, so they're not concerned, with the red column on the right. They're people that are concerned about their ability to cope with change. And what we were hoping to find was 2 or 3 or 4 attributes where there were significant differences between those two groups. What we found was that for all 14, those in the right-hand column, the very concerned about their ability to cope, are significantly more concerned about all 14 of the attributes, hence why they've got the significance markers, compared to those that are not at all or not very concerned. So across the board, those that are concerned about their ability to cope are just concerned about everything. We have, however, highlighted 4 rows in light blue. Last summer's bushfires, climate change, last summer's storms, and transport stresses in the Willoughby area. The reason for highlighting those is because the difference between the green column and the red column on those 4 attributes is the smallest. So it's almost as if they're the more universal attributes. That is, they are a concern to everybody. Yes, the very concerned, the red column group, are still more concerned, but the gap's not as big. So they're almost more of a universal concern. So that's worth bearing in mind. We also asked an open-ended question to finish off, which said, what do you feel council could do to help you cope with and adapt to change? Open-ended question. We didn't give them any codes. Let them just go loose. And really what I wanted to highlight here is, again, we've cross-analysed it by the same people. Green column, they're not concerned about their ability to cope with change. Red column on the right-hand side, they are concerned. And the main response code that came out of this section was provision of information communication. And you'll notice, in fact, 17% for the green column, 19% for the orange in the middle, and 17% for the red on the right. The scores are the same. For the one code, the main code that came out, in other words, what can council do to help you cope, it was the same for everybody, whether they feel as if they can adapt to change or not. It's communication. Okay? So that's interesting.